How's it going, guys? Thank you again for joining me on this newest episode of the GSMC Chip Shot Football Podcast presented by the GSMC Sports Network. I'm your host, Manny Maradiege, bringing you guys a great show today with a lot of more new topics to talk about around the NFL and just football in general. Starting off with the chip shot story of the day, I'm going to be talking about the Cowboys yet again. Some comments made by Jerry Jones, this time specifically on Dak Prescott and his contract situation. Then I'll transition into talking more about Justin Fields and a lot of contradicting reports that are coming out a lot after the NFL Combine. And at a point where I predicted that there was going to be more answers around this issue, there seems to be a lot more questions, so I'll dive deeper into that. Then, in the later half of the show, I'll talk about some things that were discussed at the NFL Combine away from the players testing and doing their drills on the field, around off-the-field issues, contracts, negotiations, stuff like that. A little bit more rumors to discuss before I wrap it all up with the big story coming out of the NFL Combine around J.J. McCarthy and his recent surge up to the top 10-ish prospects in the NFL draft after a very solid NFL Combine and good interviews, good drills. I'm going to be talking about that and why I believe he rose and what it could mean for other quarterbacks in the draft. All that coming in today's episode. But before I start, I want to remind you guys to please use the tip and donations link if you have any questions during the live show and want to interact with me. To do so, use the tip and donations link like I mentioned. It's gsmcpodcast.net. Again, the link is easy, simple to read on the screen. It's gsmcpodcast.net. This just makes sure I'm able to see your questions pop up to the right-hand side of my screen. I'm able to interact with you guys and just makes the show a lot better if you guys have questions. At any point during the show, I'm able to see it and read it live on the air. Not only is it a big help for this show, but it's also a big help for the network and all the rest of the shows on the network as well. And it's greatly appreciated every time you guys are able to do that. But that allows me to go into the first story, as always, the chip shot story of the day, revolving around the Cowboys, just becoming a lot more prevalent in the offseason with anything they say. It's the Cowboys. Anything they do, they say it's going to make news. And again, it's just a lot of talking for now, obviously, because we're in the offseason. And this time, it's involved with their owner, Jerry Jones, and Dak Prescott. As you all know, not the best of performances in the playoff. That's a kind of the last taste we got of the Cowboys, and specifically Dak Prescott. He's actually been one of the more quiet Cowboys in this offseason up till now. But his name was brought up in a recent interview that Jerry Jones did recently after the Combine and all those activities. And I read an article on ESPN. According to Todd Archer of ESPN, Jerry Jones said in his interview that basically, in his words, he said, "My point is that we can play better. Dak can play better than he has maybe. We could argue one of the best years he's ever had in his career. But the good news is I'm convinced that he can play better, and I'm convinced that we can do some things better all the way around, and so we're all in." We're all in seems to be becoming one of the more favorite phrases for Jerry Jones. I mentioned it really at one of the earliest shows of this network, of this just show journey, that his all-in comments, what it could mean, and now he kind of brings it up again, reassuring, I think, what he's really feeling, what his goal is of this whole offseason, that he's going to try to do the best he can to push everybody to get something different out of this season. The story around the Cowboys is the playoffs, not really performing well in it. And you could fault a lot of players. A lot of people say it's on Jerry, funny enough, just because he's always in the center of things, always commenting. He's too involved is the main message everyone's kind of getting out about Jerry Jones and why this team may seem distracted. There may be added pressure on them for them to kind of crumble in the playoffs. And that's one reason. Another reason just could be simply the players. They don't show up. They have a lot of star players that do amazing in the regular season, but just fail to show up in the playoffs. And a lot of those star players, you could say, are dependent on the quarterback, Dak Prescott, and he's also at fault a lot of times getting heat from the media and just having to respond for all these shortcomings because, he is the quarterback, the presumed leader of this team. Now, you could argue him or Micah. Micah's starting to step up more into that role just this offseason with some of the comments that he's made and just trying to become more involved to get this narrative to change around the Cowboys. But sticking on Dak Prescott, he has kind of been the leader up to this point mostly, and a lot of questions are raised now because he is coming to the end of his contract. He has actually 1 year left on his contract coming into this offseason, and the Cowboys have some options that they could go with in regards to Dak Prescott, and just that initial statement from Jerry Jones kind of laid it out a little bit where he's feeling Dak Prescott is in his development, I guess you could say. Or you could argue that if he's still developing, he's about to be 27 or 28, I believe. So if he's still developing, that you could take that as an issue, or, how much better is he going to get? But regardless of that, that's a good way of seeing where Jerry Jones is feeling around him heading into this pivotal year, which is why I think we keep seeing this phrase, we're all in, we're all in. I think it's just almost a subliminal message in a way by Jerry Jones to reassure that, get that out there, get people to buy into that message, and, it's almost like a warning potentially for next offseason if things don't go right. He's already put this out there that, this is the season, we're all in. And if it doesn't pan out, people could go back to that comment and say, this is why we're seeing these changes. This is how Jerry felt. And if the team might have let him down, people go back to that quote and say, this is why. Furthermore, on this issue with Dak and this season being so important for the Cowboys, it's important, one, because, the fans, everybody wants to see the results. This team's way too talented to not produce in the playoffs, but also just with his contract. It's set to expire in 2025. He'll be an unrestricted free agent. But what's interesting about this contract is that the Cowboys can't franchise tag Dak Prescott next year if they're tight on money again. There's a clause in his contract that doesn't allow him to be tagged. And the Cowboys could just do nothing and, not extend him this offseason. If they choose to, and if they do that, no extension up until next offseason. It'll be set to count nearly $60 million against the cap with no extension, and that's obviously a bad thing. So other things that the Cowboys can do that are on the table as well, they could lower that cap figure with a new deal. They could give him a new one, but the rumors are out there that he wants to be one of the highest paid quarterbacks in the NFL. If you want to argue that he deserves it or not, that's up to you guys to decide. But that's the kind of route it's going because that's how Dak performs in the regular season. And just the feelings out of his camp are arguing that he deserves that money. Why would he argue otherwise? But regardless of that, he could get a new deal, making him one of the highest paid quarterbacks. And then, that could hinder the Cowboys as well for some reasons I'm about to get into. But another thing they could do is restructure his current deal. And if they do that, it'll create $18 million in cap space this offseason. But it'll be adding dead money next offseason in 2025 when, his contract is up and all that. We've already seen the Cowboys release their left tackle, Tyron Smith. That created a good amount of cap space, but there's still $10 million in the cap deficit. So they still have some other things to work out. The general feeling, the predicted outcome of all this offseason at least, is that people are starting to feel that the Cowboys will at least restructure that deal to create that $18 million of cap space. And, that's as far as it's going. The reports and just everybody around the Cowboys, around Dak, don't feel like an extension is going to happen this offseason. And one of the points that kind of support that is Jerry Jones, again, in that interview that I mentioned before, he went on further to say, to kind of close out his sentiment on Dak, he said, what we do there or don't do there, I couldn't say at this time in regards to Dak's contract, but the main thing is he's going to be our quarterback. And that seems great, just on the surface. He's going to be our quarterback, reassuring a little bit. But the initial part of that is when he says what we do there or don't do there kind of leaves the door open a little bit, leaves the door cracked a little bit. He's not fully committed to Dak Prescott in a way that, we're going to sign him, nobody worry about that. He didn't say that. He left the door open, just based on what he does really this offseason. If he deserves it, then I'm sure Jerry Jones won't have any issue paying him that contract that he's wanted next offseason. But, he's just still, it seems that he's in a position of uncertainty right now. All the chips have to fall, and just based on that, it looks like they won't really get an extension done this season. I think where you go from there is interesting because if you're Dak and you see these quotes, what are you thinking? You could react poorly and think, what more do I have to prove in his mind? But a lot of people could bring up a lot of things, in the playoffs and all the things like that, performing to that level of competition. He hasn't really done that. But another thing that, just surrounds this whole issue with cap and extending Dak Prescott, they're in a cap deficit like I mentioned already this year. And to say that Dak is due an extension this year and that he should get it this year, it kind of contradicts what Jerry Jones and Micah were talking about before when Micah came out and said, he's trying to filter out all these players that shouldn't be in the locker room, that shouldn't fit into the culture that they're trying to build. And seems that he's going to try and be pretty active in recruiting other players, trying to get players in here that he believes add to the culture to make them better in the playoffs. But you can't really do that if you extend Dak and then you have even less money than you already do. And, you got to pick and choose there. What do you think is best for this team? If finding those reinforcements elsewhere and just taking a gamble on Dak to see if he proves you wrong this year? Or do you extend Dak just because he's your quarterback? Everybody needs a quarterback, and hope that he gets better in the playoffs with a roster that's already talented enough, but questions still remain on their attitude, their culture. This whole offseason has been around their culture and stuff like that. And just the last thing to close this segment out is, if you extend Dak to a big contract, where does that leave you next season? If you already have a lot of money allocated to Dak, CeeDee Lamb is also due for a contract extension next offseason, and Micah, I think you can pick up his fifth-year option. I'm almost certain of it, but, he's coming up on getting a lot of money as well. So how do you allocate all that money? You might have to sacrifice. If you do have to sacrifice one of them, I'm sure 70% of Cowboys fans and anybody in that organization would choose to sacrifice Dak just because of the projection, the higher ceiling that CeeDee Lamb and Micah Parsons have in terms of performing, leadership. I already mentioned Micah's kind of stepping into that leadership role and trying to be more active with that. So if it did come down to it, I'm sure the Cowboys would choose to find a new quarterback. But, it's in a very gray area right now where a lot is being made of this situation, but really it only seems like the minimal will be done, which will be that restructuring of his contract. And then next offseason will be the biggest, potentially in a long time, for the Dallas Cowboys if they had to find a new quarterback, find a new head coach, if they fire Mike McCarthy, who's on the last year of his deal. All the questions are being brought up now, but the answers will most likely come next offseason for the Dallas Cowboys. So that's kind of where that stands right now in terms of the Cowboys and what those comments meant by Jerry Jones. That just allows me to put a pin in that conversation and move into the next segment, which will come after the first break, which we're going to jump into now. But don't go anywhere. Coming up later in the show, I mentioned J.J. McCarthy and him rising up draft boards a lot among NFL executives, as well as conversations around what was talked about in the NFL and where does Justin Fields stand with the Falcons, with these other teams that have interest in him, but no one's really pulled the trigger as of yet. All that and more coming up on the GSMC Chip Shot Football Podcast presented by the GSMC Sports Network.